So picture your current routine for just a second. Like you might be sitting in traffic right now, or maybe you're in a sleek, climate-controlled office just staring at a screen, right?
Yeah, managing like an endless flood of emails.
Exactly. I mean, you have likely built a life that's specifically designed around minimizing physical discomfort. We want things predictable.
Right, maximum convenience.
Right. And yet there is this rapidly growing demographic of, highly successful, overworked tech executives or burnt-out students, everyday professionals.
Yeah, people who think have it all figured out.
Totally. And they are looking at this very comfortable, hyper-digital reality and just deciding to walk away from it.
Yeah, temporarily at least.
Yeah. But they're voluntarily trading their curated lives, spending thousands of dollars to fly down to these remote, mosquito-dense jungle retreats in the Amazon basin.
Which is just wild to think about.
It's insane. And the main event that they are actively paying for is this multi-day gauntlet that centers around really intense, terrifying psychological unraveling.
Paired with profound, relentless physical vomiting.
Right. So why? Like, why would anyone, let alone this massive wave of modern professionals, actively seek out that kind of immense ontological shock?
I mean, it really highlights a profound paradox about modern society, We dedicate our entire lives, our economies, our technology to building these layers of insulation.
We want to be safe. We want to be numb to pain.
Exactly. But that insulation has actually created this massive vacuum of meaning. So you have this exodus into the jungle by people who feel this overwhelming compulsion to be intentionally dismantled.
Just to feel something real again.
Yeah, exactly that.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack this exact phenomenon for you. We are looking at ayahuasca.
Which is this incredibly complex, psychoactive botanical brew.
Right. It translates in the Quechua language to the spirit rope or liana of the soul. And our goal here is to explain the ayahuasca experience in simple terms, especially if you're entirely new to the topic.
We want to strip away all that romanticized wellness jargon, right?
Oh, yeah. Ignore the influencer aesthetics you see on social media. We are looking strictly at what actually happens in your brain, in your body, and out there in the jungle ecosystem.
And to do that, we've pulled together an incredible stack of research for today's deep dive. We're pulling from ethnobotanical history, advanced neuroimaging studies like fMRI scans of the brain under psychedelics.
Which are fascinating, by the way.
They really are. And we're also using comprehensive global user surveys, plus some pretty harrowing investigative reports about what goes wrong when this industry operates in the shadows.
Yeah, we are going to cover the actual chemistry of the medicine, the structure of the traditional ceremonies, the therapeutic potential, and the very severe medical dangers that no one really talks about on those wellness blogs.
Not to mention the ecological fallout of this whole global demand.
Right. But before we can even understand the whole global phenomenon, this psychedelic renaissance you keep reading about, we really have to start at the roots, literally, the molecular and historical roots.
Yeah, and the very first step there is dispelling this incredibly persistent Western myth about the brew.
Oh, the myth of antiquity, right?
Exactly. Whenever you read about ayahuasca in popular media, there's almost always this narrative that presents it as this immutable, ancient panacea.
Right, like the story is always that it's been used the exact same way, with the exact same recipe, by an unbroken lineage of tribes for countless millennia.
But the reality, if you look at rigorous ethnobotanical research, is actually a much more dynamic picture.
Let me jump in there because I think a lot of people listening, and I definitely do this too, just assume anything indigenous to the Amazon must be, thousands of years old. So how far back does the actual documented practice go?
Well, evidence suggests that the specific ritualized consumption, like the combination of plants as we understand it right now, likely only disseminated across the Western Amazon within the last few centuries.
Wait, really? Just the last few centuries?
Yeah. The very first definitive written accounts actually appear in the records of 17th century Jesuit missionaries.
Oh, wow. I had no idea it was that recent, relatively speaking.
Right, and they were exploring the region, seeing these practices, and documenting them through a very specific European religious lens. They often labeled it as a demonic potion used for witchcraft.
I mean, of course they did.
But it actually wasn't until the 19th century that the widespread adoption and standardization of the brew among different indigenous groups really cemented itself.
So it's an evolving tradition, not some static relic frozen from the dawn of humanity.
Precisely. It adapts.
That reframes the whole conversation for me. I think we project this idea of ancient purity onto it, because, I don't know, it makes us feel safer. Like it's been perfectly vetted by 1,000 years of jungle clinical trials.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
But if the practice is more modern, what exactly is the architecture of the brew itself?
So, at its core, the brew relies on this extraordinary, almost statistically impossible pharmacological synergy. It requires two entirely distinct plant species. You cannot make it with just one.
Okay, so what's the foundational plant?
The anchor is this massive, twisting rainforest canopy vine called Banisteriopsis caapi.
Which is the liana of the soul we mentioned.
Right. But here's the catch. The vine itself is not the primary hallucinogen.
Wait, it's not.
No. If you were to just prepare the vine by itself, you'd feel some physical effects, maybe some lethargy or a slight visual shift, but you absolutely would not experience those immersive cosmic visions.
Okay, so where do the visions come from?
To get that, the vine has to be combined with a secondary botanical admixture. Usually that's the leaves of a shrub called Psychotria viridis.
Locals call that chacruna, right?
Yes, exactly. Or in some regions, they use a different vine called Diplopteris caberana. But these secondary plants are the vessels for a profoundly powerful molecule, N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT.
Okay, let's pause here because this is the mechanical core of the whole mystery. You can't just eat DMT leaves and have a psychedelic experience.
Not at all.
Like, if I were to go into the jungle right now and just chew on a handful of chacruna leaves or brew them into a tea by themselves, absolutely nothing would happen to my consciousness, right?
Nothing at all. Your body is incredibly efficient at defending itself.
How so?
Well, if you ingest DMT orally, your body rapidly identifies it as a foreign compound. It gets metabolized by these specific enzymes called monoamine oxidases, MAO enzymes.
And where are those enzymes?
They live in really high concentrations in your gastrointestinal tract and your liver.
Yeah.
And their entire job is just to break down amines. They destroy the DMT molecule completely before a single microgram can reach your bloodstream.
Okay, so think of it this way. Imagine your central nervous system is a highly secure, exclusive nightclub, right?
Where this is going.
And DMT is this rowdy, unauthorized guest trying to get in. Your stomach enzymes are the aggressive, state-of-the-art bouncers at the door. The moment DMT tries to walk in, the bouncers detect it, quarantine it, and throw it out instantly.
Exactly. You never even make it to the lobby.
But the Banisteriopsis caapi vine contains these specific compounds called harmala alkaloids, harmaline, things like that.
Tetrahydroharmine, yeah.
Right. And these alkaloids act like a temporary master override code. They're like a smooth-talking VIP who distracts the bouncers just long enough for the DMT to sneak through the back door and get right up to the VIP lounger brain.
That analogy captures the pharmacology perfectly. The vine acts as a potent, reversible monoamine oxidase inhibitor, an MAOI.
So it turns off the defense system.
Exactly. By temporarily suspending that enzymatic barrier in your gut, it allows the DMT to survive the brutal digestion process. It passes into your bloodstream, travels up to your brain, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and binds to your serotonin receptors.
It is such an incredibly precise chemical lock and key. And the profound mystery, to me at least, is how people living in the Amazon basin, surrounded by literally tens of thousands of different plant species, somehow figured out that combining these two very specific, seemingly inactive plants would create this master override.
It's staggering. It's an ethnobotanical miracle, really.
So, knowing how the chemical lock is picked is one thing. But how is this potent mixture actually manufactured? I assume it's not just tossing leaves and vines into a blender, right?
Oh, no. The preparation is entirely divorced from, clinical pharmacological extraction in the West. It is a grueling, physically demanding, multi-day ritual.
What does that physical process actually look like? Walk us through it.
Well, it begins deep in the forest with the harvesting. The brewers, who are usually fasting to maintain energetic purity, carefully select the caapi vine segments, and they don't just hack away at random, they select based on the age and size of the liana.
Okay, so they harvest it, and then what?
They meticulously clean the bark, getting rid of all moss, dirt, insects. Then comes the maceration phase. They take these heavy, dense vines and smash them repeatedly with massive wooden mallets.
Let me clarify something there. They are smashing the vines with mallets, but they aren't grinding them down into a powder, right? Why not just pulverize it to get all the chemicals out faster?
Because pulverizing it into a powder would turn the whole brew into this unfilterable sludge. You wouldn't be able to drink it without ingesting massive amounts of solid plant matter.
Which I'm guessing would wreck your stomach.
Oh, it would cause immediate, catastrophic gastrointestinal distress. So smashing it with mallets just breaks the structural integrity enough to create these thin, fibrous strands. It exponentially increases the surface area for the water extraction, but it keeps the physical architecture of the plant intact.
That makes total sense. And I understand they are singing while doing this.
Yes, during all this exhausting labor, the curanderos, the healers, are continuously singing sacred songs called icaros and blowing tobacco smoke over the plant material. They believe they are literally breathing healing intentions and protective barriers right into the fibers.
So once it's all mashed up, how do they pull the DMT and the MAOIs out of the plants?
They use this strategic layering technique. In massive cauldrons, they alternate layers of the mashed vine with thick layers of the chacruna leaves. Then they submerge the whole thing in fresh water and boil it over an open wood fire.
Which sounds like a delicate process.
Very. Managing the fire is high stakes. If it gets too hot, they risk denaturing the volatile alkaloids, which ruins the medicine's potency.
And it's not just one boil and you're done, right? It's a repeating cycle.
Right, a multi-wash extraction. They boil it for hours, drain off the golden brown water, set it aside. Then they add entirely fresh water to the exhausted plants and start over. They might do this 3, 4, or 5 times over several days.
Wow. Days of boiling.
Yeah, and finally, they take all those dozens of liters of infused fluid, combine them, and do a very slow, deliberate reduction over the fire. They boil it all down into a thick, viscous, dark brown liquid.
So massive volumes of water reduced down to just a little bit.
Maybe just 1 or 2 liters of active medicine. Then it's filtered, bottled, and the shaman gives a spiritual blessing to activate it.
Okay, so while all of this intense physical labor is happening in the jungle, there's an equally grueling protocol happening to the person who is actually preparing to drink it, right?
Yes, the dieta.
Exactly, the dieta. Because if you were listening to this and thinking, I'll just sign up for a retreat, you really need to understand that you don't just show up on a Friday night after eating a pepperoni pizza and throwing back some beers.
Definitely not. The dieta is this foundational requirement across almost all traditional ayahuasca settings. It demands strict abstinence. You have to cut out salt, refined sugar, red meat, alcohol, caffeine, and all sexual activity.
And for how long? Like just the day before?
No, this spans days, sometimes weeks, prior to and following the ceremony.
So why is that level of restriction necessary? A lot of wellness centers market the dieta as like a tropical detox or a gut cleanse. Is it really just about clearing out your stomach?
Calling it a biological detox is a very Western reduction. In the traditional framework, the dieta serves multiple purposes. Spiritually, it shows sacrifice and respect to the plant spirits.
Like proving your commitment.
Exactly. Energetically, they believe foods like salt and heavy meats ground your energy, blocking the subtle shifts the plant induces. But physically, and this is key, it is absolute essential preparation for an immense physiological trauma.
The brew is that taxing.
Incredibly taxing on your gastrointestinal and cardiovascular systems. The dieta clears the system, lowers your baseline physiological noise, and makes sure your body is as receptive as possible to handle the acute shock of the alkaloids.
Now, if the practice is evolving and adapting, like we discussed with the Jesuit accounts, who actually traditionalized these specific frameworks, did one specific group invent the dieta and the brewing method?
Well, the frameworks are woven into these incredibly diverse, localized cultural tapestries. Each group brings its own interpretation. For example, the Shipibo-Canibo people in Peru.
Oh, they do those intricate geometric patterns, right?
Yes. Their engagement with ayahuasca is inextricably linked to that maze-like geometric art. Their shamans use the brew to navigate visual, energetic realms, and they believe they are physically manifesting those healing patterns into the patient's energetic field.
That's beautiful. What about other groups?
Contrast that with the Chicano groups in Colombia. They integrate the vine deeply into their creation myths. For them, the trance is required to communicate with ancestral spirits and reinforce their societal structure.
And historically, some groups used it for totally different reasons. I mean, the Shuar people of Ecuador and Peru utilized the brew not just for healing, but for divination and even preparing their warriors for combat.
Right, which is a wildly different context than a modern yoga retreat. It shows the incredible versatility of the brew. But we also have to look at the massive historical disruptions that altered all these traditions.
Like what?
The brutal Amazonian rubber booms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They forced countless indigenous people into slave labor camps. It violently mixed different tribes and forced their knowledge to hybridize with Western and Catholic influences.
So that's where you get the blend of traditions.
Exactly. It gave rise to mestizo shamanism, a blend of indigenous plant medicine, rural Catholicism, and folk healing. And then in Brazil in the 20th century, this hybridization led to legally recognized ayahuasca religions.
Like Santo Daime.
Yes, Santo Daime and the União do Vegetal. They use the brew as a holy sacrament. They conduct ceremonies in brightly lit halls, wearing uniforms, blending Christian liturgy with indigenous botany.
Okay, so we have this deeply complex, turbulent history. But let's bring it back to the individual. You've adhered to the grueling dieta for weeks, your body is clear, and the brew has been smashed, boiled for days, and blessed. You are sitting in the dark in a circular maloca in the jungle.
Okay, setting the scene.
Let's walk the listener step by step through this somatic reality. What actually happens when that cup of viscous, earthy liquid touches your lips?
All right, the timeline of a standard night. You ingest the medicine. It is incredibly astringent, very earthy, and frankly, quite foul tasting.
Sounds rough.
It is. For the first 30 to 45 minutes, you might just sit there in the dark feeling nothing but some nervous anticipation. But then, as those MAOIs disable your gut enzymes and the DMT begins to cross the blood-brain barrier, your autonomic nervous system violently activates.
And this activation initiates what is universally known as la purga, the purge.
Yes.
To be totally unambiguous for you listening, we need to state clearly what this means physically. It means severe projectile vomiting. It means sudden diarrhea, profuse sweating, violent shaking, excessive yawning, and uncontrollable crying. Your body just goes into an absolute overdrive of expulsion.
It really does. And indigenous practitioners do not view ayahuasca primarily as a hallucinogen. They classify it fundamentally as a purgative medicine. In many regions, the ceremony itself is simply called la purga. The expulsion isn't a side effect, it is the main event.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here, because if you describe this to a conventional Western doctor or just like an average person on the street, this sounds functionally identical to a severe case of food poisoning.
Coupled with a delirious hallucination from dehydration, maybe?
Exactly. So how do practitioners, or even the people experiencing it, separate a profound spiritual purge from the simple reality that the body is violently rejecting a highly toxic, awful-tasting liquid?
That is a critical distinction, and it bridges the gap between biology and psychology.
Yeah.
The Western gastroenterological view absolutely classifies the vomiting and diarrhea as adverse physiological side effects of alkaloid toxicity. Your body senses a complex chemical load and hits the eject button. However, the indigenous and the modern somatic psychotherapeutic view sees the purge as the absolute core mechanism of emotional healing. It's not just clearing physical matter. It is experienced as a state of hyper-heightened proprioception.
Okay, break down proprioception for us. What does that actually mean when you're sitting in the jungle feeling violently ill?
Proprioception is your brain's internal 3D map of your body. It's how you sense your own internal physical state. Under ayahuasca, this internal mapping becomes exponentially magnified, while the boundary between physical sensation and emotional memory completely dissolves.
So you're feeling emotions physically.
Exactly. Participants report that the purge is not just stomach bile. They experience it as the literal, visceral expulsion of embodied trauma, suppressed emotional pain, toxic behavioral patterns, what indigenous healers call pathogenic spiritual objects.
Wow.
They frequently describe sensing an external, intelligent force navigating their organs, identifying specific sites of emotional distress, and physically cutting them out to be vomited into a bucket.
And the subjective experience of the relief seems to be the main differentiator, right? Like if you get food poisonings, you vomit, and you're left feeling depleted, feverish, and sick for days.
Yes.
But the reports from ayahuasca users claim that the physical act of violently vomiting is immediately followed by this profound, undeniable, psychological unburdening, a certain clarity and lightness that completely defies the biological exhaustion of throwing up.
Precisely. That sudden transition is what fascinates researchers. The immediate cessation of physical distress paired with overwhelming euphoria suggests a massive reset of the autonomic nervous system. You go from extreme sympathetic fight or flight into a profound parasympathetic rest and digest state in seconds.
Okay, so once that physical purge clears out the trauma and the body settles, the medicine pulls you aggressively into the visionary realm. I think this is what most people picture when they think of psychedelics. What does that internal landscape actually look like?
The visual component operates on an escalating trajectory. In the early stages, as the DMT fully engages your visual cortex, you perceive relatively simple, eyes-closed geometric hallucinations. Shifting fractals, glowing grids, spinning spirals, highly saturated patterns.
And they pulse to sound, don't they?
Yes. What's fascinating to neuroscientists is that these geometric patterns frequently exhibit synesthesia. They pulse, change color, and shift in direct, synchronized response to auditory stimuli in the room.
So if a bird calls outside or a branch snaps, the visual grid you are seeing behind your eyelids will actually ripple or explode with color in time with the sound.
Exactly. And more importantly, the visuals react to the shaman's singing, the icaros. As the plasma concentration of DMT peaks, those symbol geometric grids break open and coalesce into highly complex, immersive, three-dimensional narrative landscapes.
You transition from observing shapes to stepping into entire worlds.
Right. Users encounter fully formed anthropomorphic entities, ancestral spirits, deities, and archetypal animals, most commonly massive serpents, jaguars, and birds of prey.
And a striking commonality in user reports is that these visions do not feel like random, chaotic dream debris. They feel hyper-real, entirely autonomous, and deeply intelligent.
Yes, people report that these entities actively communicate with them, delivering direct instruction about their life choices, forcing them to confront their destructive habits, dissecting their relationships.
But navigating that intense, sometimes terrifying visionary landscape is not something you do alone. That's the primary job of the shaman, right?
Yes, the shaman acts as the architect and the anchor of the experience, and they accomplish this through the continuous singing of the echoes. They use these songs to evoke benevolent plant spirits, build a literal perimeter of psychic protection, and actively modulate the intensity.
So if things get too intense...
If the room becomes too chaotic, the shaman alters the tempo, pitch, and volume of the icaro to guide the group back to baseline.
And there is actual clinical science backing up why the singing is so critical here, isn't there? It's not just mood music. It's mechanically altering brain function. Like, what exactly is an icaro doing to my brain while I'm hallucinating a giant serpent?
Ethnomusicological research has studied the acoustic properties of traditional icaros. The findings suggest that the rapid, rhythmic vocalizations act as a vital auditory anchor for a brain that is losing its grip on consensus reality. The specific frequencies promote theta brain wave activity.
Translate theta waves for us. What state of mind is that?
Theta waves dominate your brain when you are in a state of deep meditation, or in that liminal twilight state right before you fall asleep. It's a state of deep inward focus and heightened suggestibility.
So when you're terrified.
Right. When a participant is facing a terrifying, ego-dissolving vision, the shaman's song provides an external regulating metric. It gives the auditory cortex a rhythmic structure to hold on to, preventing the individual from succumbing to total panic.
That's incredible. Let's pull the lens back and look at the global architecture of the brain during this process. We know ayahuasca profoundly alters brain network dynamics. And the core of this research revolves around something called the default mode network, or the DMN. How does the medicine interact with the DMN?
So the default mode network is a highly connected network of brain regions. You can think of the DMN as the biological seat of your ego. It manages your self-construct, your rumination on past regrets, your anxiety about the future, your internal monologue. When you're daydreaming or worrying, your DMN is highly active.
Okay, so what does the brew do to it?
fMRI scans show that ayahuasca heavily dampens and disintegrates the connectivity within this network. It essentially silences the ego, it reduces top-down cognitive control, and drastically increases bottom-up information transfer.
I want to make sure we truly understand this. So think of your brain like a massive, highly rigid corporate bureaucracy.
Okay, I'm following.
The default mode network is the CEO and the executive board. Every piece of information, every memory, every sensory input from the lower departments has to be routed up to the CEO, who filters it, stamps it with their specific biases, and sends it back down.
Right.
Now, if you have depression or trauma, that CEO is a tyrant, constantly forcing the company to repeat the same failed strategies over and over. Ayahuasca effectively locks the CEO out of the building. Suddenly, top-down control is gone.
And the departments can finally talk to each other.
Exactly. The mailroom can talk directly to the R&D department. The marketing team is hanging out with the janitorial staff.
Yeah.
Brain regions that have not communicated in decades are suddenly interacting freely and directly.
That is an excellent way to visualize the temporary disintegration of rigid neural pathways. This unconstrained crosstalk is heavily theorized to be the exact mechanism that allows patients to break out of deeply entrenched, maladaptive thought patterns. It induces a psychological phenomenon called decentering.
What's decentering?
It's the sudden ability to observe your own deep-seated traumas, your worst memories, completely objectively. You can view them from a state of non-judgmental detachment without triggering your usual defensive ego barriers or panic response.
The clinical data emerging from this state is undeniably compelling. I mean, we are seeing trials demonstrating rapid-acting, statistically significant relief for patients suffering from treatment-resistant depression, where traditional SSRIs have completely failed.
Yes, and massive potential for substance use disorders, breaking the psychological loops of addiction. And for PTSD, it seems to accelerate fear extinction learning, rewiring the brain to understand the triggers are now safe.
However, we must remain rigorously objective about the science here. For the last decade, the psychedelic community has loudly championed the claim that these substances cure mental illness by actively promoting neuroplasticity, literally growing new brain cells, by drastically increasing levels of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
But there is a massive recent update on that front that completely changes the narrative.
Right. What happened in May 2024?
In May 2024, a major, highly cited meta-analysis regarding psychedelic-induced BDNF elevation was officially retracted from the Journal of Psychopharmacology.
Retracted entirely.
Yes, independent statistical reviewers audited the data and found deep analytical errors. They concluded that there is currently no robust, reliable evidence that compounds like ayahuasca consistently increase BDNF levels in humans. The data was flawed.
This is such a crucial point for anyone following psychedelic science. The clinical results are real people are walking out of retreats reporting their depression is gone. But the specific molecular why is still fiercely debated. The mechanism of synapse growth we thought we understood is in serious question.
Precisely. And while the potential for a mental reset is staggering, that CEO locked out of the building state makes the human brain and body incredibly vulnerable. Your defenses are down. Which brings us to a topic dangerously underdiscussed in wellness circles: the severe, explicitly lethal medical risks.
This cannot be overstated. Because retreats are marketed alongside yoga and green juice cleanses, people just assume ayahuasca is a benign, natural supplement. But this is a heavy-duty, chaotic pharmacological intervention.
It induces massive systemic stress, transient, highly dose-dependent increases in heart rate, severe tachycardia, and significantly elevated blood pressure. If you have an undiagnosed heart condition, the acute cardiovascular strain is a massive risk.
The cardiovascular stress isn't even the most acute danger, right? The mechanism that actually leads to fatalities comes from pharmacological interactions.
Yes. We have to return to the MAOIs in the vine. Their entire function is to halt the enzymatic degradation of neurotransmitters. When you introduce modern, synthesized daily medications into an environment where your body cannot break down neurotransmitters, you initiate a lethal biochemical cascade.
Let's break this down very specifically for you. Say I am taking a standard daily antidepressant, an SSRI. If I don't disclose that to the retreat center and I drink ayahuasca, what actually happens inside my body?
It creates a catastrophic feedback loop. The MAOIs from the vine are actively preventing your body from breaking down existing serotonin. Meanwhile, your prescribed SSRI is actively blocking the reabsorption of serotonin in your brain.
Oh, wow. So it just builds up.
Yes. It leads to a massive, uncontrollable accumulation of serotonin in your synaptic clefts. This triggers a severe neurological crisis known as serotonin syndrome.
And that's life-threatening.
Highly life-threatening. Symptoms include extreme hyperthermia. Your core body temperature can spike over 101 degrees, severe muscle rigidity, autonomic instability, delirium, and potentially fatal grand mal seizures.
So what's the protocol?
A participant must undergo a medically supervised tapering off of all SSRIs for 2 to 6 weeks prior to a ceremony, depending on the medication.
And the danger extends far beyond SSRIs. What if someone mixes ayahuasca with recreational stimulants like amphetamines or MDMA?
Mixing MAOIs with stimulants triggers a massive hypertensive crisis. Your blood pressure skyrockets to stroke-inducing levels, along with severe hyperthermia and potential sudden cardiac arrest.
What about painkillers, like tramadol?
Tramadol inherently lowers your neurological seizure threshold. When you combine that weakened threshold with the massive neurochemical storm from DMT and MAOIs, your stability is completely compromised. It almost guarantees severe seizures.
Wow.
Even central nervous system depressants, sleeping pills, and antipsychotics can interact unpredictably, causing profound respiratory depression where the body simply forgets to breathe.
Beyond the immediate physiological interactions, we also have to look at the psychological risks. You are dismantling the ego. What happens when the ego doesn't put itself back together properly?
The Global Ayahuasca Survey analyzed data from over 10,000 international users, and the statistics are sobering. Over 50% of respondents reported some form of adverse mental health effect following their consumption of the brew.
Over 50%. That is a staggering statistic.
It is. Now, it's important to contextualize that many of those adverse effects were mild or transient, maybe a few weeks of heightened anxiety as they process the memories. However, for individuals with a personal or familial history of conditions like psychosis, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, the risk is exponentially magnified.
We are talking about the potential for acute, long-term psychiatric destabilization.
Yes, drug-induced psychotic episodes. For those with underlying vulnerabilities, the brew can act as a profound trigger, initiating episodes of persistent, terrifying paranoia, delusions of grandeur, and HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, where the visual hallucinations continue for months or years.
Going back to our corporate analogy, if the default mode network CEO was the only thing holding the company together and keeping deep, latent psychosis at bay, firing the CEO doesn't lead to harmony. It leads to an absolute, unrecoverable structural collapse.
In extreme cases, this destabilization leads to psychotically mediated violence, requiring the individual to be admitted to forensic psychiatric wards.
That is the harsh reality of biohacking the human mind. And this deep misunderstanding of the gravity of the medicine leads directly to our next profound issue. What happens when highly vulnerable, emotionally desperate modern people travel thousands of miles to seek out ancient healing in a completely unregulated, rapidly globalizing market?
It inevitably leads to horrifying cautionary tales. You are entering the remote jungle, consuming a substance that makes you incredibly psychologically suggestible, and handing total control of your physical and mental safety over to unregulated facilitators.
We really must critically examine cases like the tragic death of Sebastian Woodruff in the Peruvian Amazon.
Yes. Woodruff was a Canadian man who sought out ayahuasca to address deep personal struggles. However, during his time in the jungle, he became deeply, violently, psychologically destabilized.
Because of underlying vulnerabilities.
Forensic experts noted that individuals with underlying conditions, such as bipolar disorder, are at an exceptionally high risk for this kind of unraveling. The exact sequence of events culminated in violence and his subsequent murder by locals. It serves as a grim warning about the absolute necessity of robust psychiatric screening and continuous professional aftercare.
And the negligence isn't just isolated to the deep Amazon. It happens at domestic retreats in Western countries, too. Look at the coronial inquest into the death of Jared Antonovich at a retreat in Australia.
Right, he was given a highly dangerous combination of ayahuasca and kambo.
Let's briefly explain kambo. It is a toxic, waxy secretion harvested from a giant monkey frog in the Amazon, used as an extreme physical purgative. It causes intense vomiting and swelling.
The combination is incredibly taxing on the body. During that ceremony, Antonovich suffered a perforated esophagus, likely induced by the violent, relentless purging. But instead of recognizing a medical emergency and calling an ambulance, the retreat's elders viewed his agony through a distorted spiritual lens.
They assumed he was just purging dark energy.
Yes, they dangerously delayed medical intervention. And testimony revealed that after his death, leaders instructed witnesses to remain quiet and conspired to mislead the police about what substances had been consumed.
This highlights a massive blind spot in the wellness community. We project this trope of the flawless, mystical, perfectly enlightened shaman onto human beings who are essentially operating highly lucrative, entirely unregulated pop-up hospitals in the jungle.
Because they use feathers and sing ancient songs, we completely bypass our own safety protocols. We leave all our critical thinking at the airport.
That phenomenon is rooted in the exoticization of indigenous people, and it leads to dangerous distortions. Western tourists arrive demanding authentic shamanism, but they only want the parts of the authenticity that they find aesthetically pleasing.
Right. For example, retreat organizers frequently instruct their shamans to eliminate vital traditional elements, like blowing heavy tobacco smoke over the participants. They do it because the heavy smoke offends Western sensibilities and breaks the immersion of their peaceful retreat.
They are actively altering ancient rituals, merely to appease consumer demand.
And the power dynamic created in these spaces is terrifying. You have the total pharmacological dissolution of a participant's ego defenses, combined with a cultural conditioning that romanticizes the facilitators as infallible authorities.
This combination has created a deeply troubling, underreported epidemic of sexual abuse within the retreat industry.
It is a severe systemic issue. Predatory individuals explicitly exploit these misconceptions. They use the pretense of healing sexual trauma or clearing chakras to coerce highly suggestible participants, predominantly women, into non-consensual sexual contact while under the influence of the medicine.
Organizations dedicated to psychedelic ethics, like Chacruna, have had to establish public community guidelines to combat this exact predation. They explicitly state that sexual intercourse between a healer and a participant is considered a severe, dangerous spiritual transgression in all legitimate indigenous traditions.
They advocate for mandatory safety protocols, strict buddy systems, rigorous background checks, and the mandatory presence of female facilitators during all ceremonies.
Hearing all of this, the risk of serotonin syndrome, the permanent psychiatric unraveling, the predatory facilitators, the grueling purge, it begs the ultimate question. Why are Westerners risking all of this? Why are thousands of people happily paying to navigate this minefield?
Sociologists analyze this mass migration as a profound symptom of the modern meaning crisis. We are living in a state of deep, pervasive alienation. We suffer from acute digital burnout.
Sitting in front of screens for 10 hours a day.
We've witnessed the dissolution of traditional community structures under neoliberal capitalism. Our Western paradigm, rooted in scientific rationalism and hyper-individualism, is great at producing technology, but it frequently fails to provide any deep existential fulfillment.
So people suffering from refractory depression and anxiety are desperately seeking a radical, undeniable connection to an animistic, interconnected web of life. They want to feel that the universe is alive, and they are willing to risk everything to feel it.
But the tragedy is that as millions of Westerners flood into the Amazon basin seeking to connect with nature, they are literally physically consuming the forest itself to achieve that connection.
Let's examine the ecological collapse that the ayahuasca boom is triggering right now.
The soaring, unprecedented global demand has triggered an acute ecological crisis. We have to look at the biology of the Banisteriopsis copy vine. It is an apex liana. It requires years, sometimes decades, of continuous growth high into the canopy to achieve the immense size necessary for ceremonial use.
So to be clear, this isn't like growing tomatoes or cannabis. You can't just set up a massive commercial greenhouse in California and grow ceremonial-grade vines in a few weeks.
Exactly. And the aggressive, largely unregulated wild harvesting driven by the international retreat industry has completely decimated mature wild populations in regions like Peru. Harvesters are going deeper and deeper into the forest.
And removing these apex vines threatens not only the availability of the medicine for local indigenous groups, but it actually threatens the structural integrity of the localized forest canopy itself, since these massive vines physically tie the trees together.
Furthermore, the Psychotria viridis shrub, the chacruna leaves, is also facing severe depletion due to overharvesting.
I have to ask, though, is it entirely the fault of Western tourists seeking healing? Or does the blame also lie with local governments who are failing to protect their own resources in the face of a lucrative export market?
It is an incredibly complex web. The demand is undeniably driven by Western capital, but the extraction is often carried out by deeply impoverished local populations who finally see a viable economic opportunity. The lack of robust regulatory frameworks makes wild harvesting the path of least resistance.
So what are the solutions? How do we stop extracting the jungle to death?
Currently, there are two radically diverging paths. First, you have biocultural conservation efforts. Indigenous communities in Brazil, like the Yawanawa, along with groups like Santo Daime, are initiating organized, large-scale cultivation and reforestation projects.
Ethical retreat centers are dedicating revenue to indigenous reciprocity funds to transition to sustainable agriculture.
Right. But the global market is growing exponentially, threatening to outpace those restorative efforts. Which brings us to the second, highly controversial path, pharmahuasca.
Pharmahuasca, that's the attempt to synthesize the entire experience.
Exactly. It combines pharmaceutical or lab-extracted MAOIs, often from the Syrian rue plant, with synthetic, lab-produced DMT, usually in a precise pill format.
It offers a controlled dosage, bypassing the ecological crisis, and because it lacks the heavy plant tannins, it often completely avoids the intense gastrointestinal purge.
But traditionalist and indigenous practitioners argue forcefully that pharmahuasca completely strips the experience of its vital context. It reduces a holistic, culturally grounded spiritual journey into a sterile biochemical transaction.
But regardless of whether you drank the traditional brew in a jungle maloka or take a pill in a clinic in London, you still have to face the final and arguably most difficult phase of the entire journey: integration.
Integration is where the vast majority of people fail. Integration is the vital active process of translating those profound ego-dissolving insights into sustainable, tangible, daily lifestyle changes. Because there's a massive epistemological chasm between the jungle and your cubicle.
We really need to look at how different cultures view the medicine to understand why integration is so hard for us.
Traditional indigenous praxis views ayahuasca as a spirit that connects the healer to the broader spirit world. Historically, the sick patient didn't even drink the brew. Solely, the shaman drank it to diagnose the illness and prescribe a cure.
Modern Western therapy, however, radically reduces the medicine to a neurochemical trigger designed exclusively for individual breakthroughs.
This fundamental incommensurability becomes dangerous when you return home.
Integration is the hardest part. You had the most profound experience of your life, you've seen the interconnectedness of all things, and then you land at JFK Airport, commute to your apartment, and log onto a stressful Zoom call with a boss you resent.
You realize your daily life is built on a foundation that cannot support the profound insights you just had. It's like downloading a massive software update for your brain while you're in the jungle.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Right. But when you get back home, you realize your daily life is running on outdated hardware that can't support the new operating system. You crash.
Studies show that actively creating new self-narratives and making massive lifestyle shifts are absolutely central to maintaining the effects. But returning to a hyper-individualistic society often causes those insights to rapidly decay.
In traditional settings, the community shares the cosmological framework. In the West, without community scaffolding, users struggle intensely.
It leads directly to integration failure. People fall into profound depression and existential dread because they cannot reconcile the magic of the jungle with modern life. You can't just drop back into your old routine. Long-term therapy, community scaffolding, and continuous work are absolutely essential.
The severe lack of structured professional aftercare at many commercial retreats leaves vulnerable people to process these massive ontological shocks entirely alone. And compounding all of this is the highly fragmented global legal framework.
Under the UN's 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, isolated DMT is a Schedule I drug. But natural plant materials containing DMT are not explicitly regulated internationally.
Which leaves a massive gray area. In Brazil, it is protected for religious use. In Bolivia, it's cultural heritage. But in the US and Canada, it remains strictly legal without a rare religious exemption.
This legal landscape forces modern users seeking mental health treatment into quasi-religious structures just to avoid criminal prosecution. It creates this bizarre legal fiction where therapeutic use is criminalized unless clothed in approved liturgical garb.
It's incredibly complicated.
Let's summarize the incredibly dense journey we've taken you on today. We started by dissecting the brilliant chemical lock-and-key mechanism, detailing how the MAOIs act as a master override for DMT. We explored the multi-day physical labor of the brew and the rigorous preparation of the dieta.
We faced the visceral reality of the purge, how vomiting is intertwined with trauma release, and discussed the incredible promise for dampening the default mode network while acknowledging the flawed data regarding BDNF.
We outlined the lethal biological dangers of mixing the brew with pharmaceuticals like SSRIs, the acute risk of triggering latent psychosis, and the devastating ecological toll our search for meaning is taking on the Amazon.
And yet, despite all the clinical data, the fMRI scans, and the pharmacological profiling, we have to acknowledge the immense mystery of it all. Reducing ayahuasca merely to a serotonin receptor agonist completely fails to capture the profound intelligence of the experience. There is so much we simply do not know.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider long after this deep dive ends. We talked about pharmahuasca, putting the active chemicals in a scaro pill, bypassing the jungle and the culture.
Right.
If we do that, if we synthesize the effects without the spiritual context, does it cease to be a sacred medicine? Does it just become another highly priced Western pharmaceutical band-aid? Can we truly extract the chemical cure for our modern alienation, while simultaneously discarding the very relationship to nature that might be the actual source of the healing?
It is the ultimate philosophical question at the heart of the psychedelic renaissance, and how we answer it will define the future of mental health.
If you enjoyed this deep dive and found value in unpacking the science and history with us, please remember to hit the follow and subscribe buttons to ensure you don't miss our next exploration. And a heartfelt thank you to everyone who already supports this show, shares these deep dives, and learns alongside us every week. Until next time.